Well, this is the Richard and Judy Book Club again, in conjunction with WHSmith. And if you visit this website very often and you look at the blogs that Judy and I sometimes write here, you'll know by now that we consider the opening of books very, very important. I know there are those that say that sometimes you have to give a book time and you get halfway through and then it starts to pick up, but I particularly don't believe in that creed. I think that every chapter should work and the opening should grab you. And my God, the opening chapter of The Return of Captain John Emmett grabs you by the throat. It's 1920 in England, southeast England. It's late at night, it's about 11 o'clock, and it's a station platform that should be deserted at that time, but in fact is full of people waiting for something. And most of the people standing on the platform are women, because this is 1920 and a whole generation of young men and not so young men have been wiped out in the slaughter of the First World War. So what are they waiting for? Well, clearly it's a train, and it finally arrives, not going too fast, but it doesn't stop. And as the train goes past them, they all stare into the carriages, and each one is brilliantly illuminated, brilliantly lit inside, but there's nobody in. It's completely without a passenger, except for the central carriage. And there's one man in there, and he's dead, because he's the corpse of the unknown soldier on his way to Westminster to be buried, where he lies today, in Westminster Abbey. And Elizabeth Speller, if that isn't a great opening to a book, I don't know what is. And it sets the tone. The writing in this book is beautiful, and it came as no surprise to learn that, in fact, you're a poet, and this is the first time you've actually tried to write a novel. I say tried, it's a stunning success. It's a mystery. It's a mystery set in 1920, just after the First War. Why did you set it there?
I was just really interested, not so much in the war, but how a country and little communities and people can possibly recover from a time when they'd lost 1 million men. You know, everybody's sons and husbands. I think somebody said there's not a single family in Britain that wasn't touched by it in some way. And how do we go on? And yet we went on. And actually, we went into the modern age, really. We changed and we grew from it.
And many of the survivors, the men who came home, were damaged for life, either physically or mentally. And much of the book is about those mental scars that men brought back with them, including Captain John Emmett, who we very quickly learn is dead. He appears to have committed suicide. He clearly had what we would today call as post-battle syndrome, what they then called shell shock. And that's at the core of the book. That's the mystery. Why did he die? How did he die? And why was he in this peculiar mental state? How much research did you do into what they called shell shock? Because it's very, very intricately written.
I did a great deal, really. I looked at the papers of psychiatrists. I looked at letters from people being sent home and what their own captains and colonels thought of them, which wasn't much on the whole. And I looked at the letters of families who got these men home, and some of their lives were terrible. I mean, domestic violence, prison. These were damaged men, but really didn't have psychiatry. They were just being absorbed back into their communities with great difficulty, and some of them killed themselves.
Wait, the story starts with, apart from the chapter about the unknown warrior, the story starts with this rather likeable young man, Lawrence Bartram, who's been through the war, has lost his wife and baby, not as a result of the war, but just something completely different. He's now totally rootless and kind of not shell-shocked, because he isn't, but he's living in a kind of strange no man's world, really.
Well, you say he's amputated from his past.
Yeah. Yes. I thought that because I'd read a letter which in a soldier's belongings, and he died in a battle. But among his things were a letter from his wife saying that their child had died. He'd got that letter in the morning of a 5-year-old. He had 2 letters, one saying the child was sick, another the child had died. And then he went over the top, because that's what you did. Yes. And that made me think, what about the men? You know, there's still life expectancy wasn't wonderful in Britain in 1940.
He is then contacted by Mary Emmett, who is the sister of Captain John Emmett, who has apparently committed suicide, who survived the war, who has obviously been seriously damaged, has been in some kind of institution, sort of escaped from the institution in some kind of way, and was discovered dead. And it's assumed that he committed suicide. And his sister really wants to know, and she wants Lawrence to know, who knew him at school. to find out exactly what happened, which is precisely what he does. And it is a thriller because
it's quite Bulldog Drummond, actually. And in fact, you refer to Bulldog Drummond, but it does have overtones of that as he and a friend Charles tear around the country in an old Albus or brand new Albus, fast car, going from location to location on the trail. And of course, they, as you were saying, that they turn up more and more individuals and clues, and it becomes a very complex investigation, which I think would tax a professional detective, let alone a slightly shell-shocked soldier out of the trenches.
On the other hand, it does bring him back to life.
Yes,
because he's engaged, he has to engage with other people, and he knows he could stay in his little flat and do nothing for the rest of his life if he chose it.
Yeah, so. and the kernel of the story, really, I don't think this is giving anything away, but it is the execution of a young officer, a British officer, during the war. Not even for desertion, just because he was walking the wrong way, and the orders he got were very confused, and he was court-martialed and sentenced to execution.
Which is very unusual for an officer to be.
Yes.
And in fact, you make the point that, I think in your afterword, you make the point that only 3 officers were actually executed in this way.
There were 350 or 346 soldiers and just 3 officers.
And that's partly because back home in England, and as you say in the book, the front was only a day's journey away. These men would come back to London, if not Paris, party, see their families, see their children, get on a train at 8 o'clock in the morning, be back in the trenches at 8 o'clock that night. And fighting by tea,
and people in London heard the guns, so they knew on the first day of the Somme, people walked around, they knew something bad.
They could hear it.
Was happening.
It's a rumble.
Yeah. They could hear the explosions.
But as I was about to say, that the families back in England, if an officer was up on a charge, a court-martial, and had the prospect of being shot, my God, the phone wires hummed between London and the front.
They were well connected.
And they got them out of it.
I mean, there were people who were done for desertion. In every case, they went into hospital or they were relocated to London.
Yes.
Right.
The case I have in my book is vaguely based on one young man, and he didn't have friends. No. And he'd been promoted from the ranks, and he wasn't one of the inner circle.
And they needed a quote, because so many enlisted men were being shot, and privates were being shot. They needed a few token officers as well,
but not ones that people
cared about
terribly much.
Yeah.
And they weren't terribly good officers.
No.
They weren't heroes.
Yeah.
And his execution goes horribly wrong.
Yes.
As executions have a tendency to do, actually.
They did.
Yes.
A lot of the times. They used to swap the guns around so that soldiers, who were often shooting their own officer, they didn't know which one had a bullet in. It's a sort of convention. But actually it meant that most of them couldn't shoot the guns they'd got because they were often the wrong size, they weren't used to them. So they botched it on a lot of occasions.
Yes.
And then on that occasion, the officer in charge should then have finished the poor chap off. That's what, and that again we come to this because it is all about the relationships within this tight little community that the whole story is set. I also liked at the end. I mean, obviously Lawrence, bless him, has got great feelings for Mary Emmett, John Emmett's sister, and she has for him too, quite clearly. But just to make the point about the damage that people live. Actually, I'm not going to say what happens, but she basically that he cannot, as he'd love obviously to make her his wife because her heart is elsewhere, but hopelessly elsewhere.
Yes. I mean, that's a sort of, I think, very restrained damage that perhaps we don't do now, where we have closure and we talk about our emotions. Yeah. But people can sort of just go around not talking about things.
Well, the novel works on so many different levels. As I said at the beginning, it's beautifully written. It's a pleasure to read. It really is. As I say, your other job as a poet, it comes out very clearly. The plot is fantastic. It's really thrilling, and you race to the end, and the pace really develops as you get to the end. But it has a wonderful sense of time and place. It really does, and a lost England, of course. Yes. An England of country lanes and dusty lanes and no superstores or supermarkets or multi-storey car parks, a completely lost age. Beautifully drawn in these pages. It's lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great pleasure. And if you want to read the book, read about the book, read what we think about the book, what you think about the book, just go to the WHSmith website, which is www.whsmith.co.uk/Richard and Judy, and it's all there. And you'll love it. It's great.